Tickletober Day. 6. Cuddles by Featherquillforhire. Summary. Wirt and Sara decide to have a movie night and Wirt finds himself distracted. People in general were very warm. Wirt had never thought much about it before Sara. And aside from Greg annoyingly and persistently scrambling onto his lap at a moment's notice, he hadn't had much experience being up close and personal with people, so there was never much reason to dwell on the concept. Until now. Sara was warm. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he could feel her breath on his neck, raising goosebumps across his skin. One of her hands was intertwined with his, and she couldn't stop fiddling with his fingers, it seemed. A thumb was always bumping into his, or rubbing against his palm, fingers crossing and uncrossing over his own at random. She was curled around him, and her warmth was like a furnace, comforting and nerve-wracking all at once if you got too close to it. In theory, they were watching a movie, but Sara had paused it hours ago to tell him some fact about snails, and they had never turned it back on. So he kind of wished she would, only so he could give in to the pressing urge to fall asleep without her noticing. How was it possible to be so nervous and so relaxed all at once? "You have a scar." The voice was so sudden in the comfortable silence that Wirt couldn't help a small jump of surprise. He cleared his throat quickly, trying to recover from the momentary social fumble. "I'm sorry?" "On your hand." Sara nodded towards the spot in question, brushing her thumb over it for good measure. It was a small, jagged line across his palm, faded from time. He had nearly forgotten about it till then. "Just an accident on my bike," Wirt explained, wincing a bit at the lie. In truth, it had come from his time in that place, after a branch had snagged against his hand while running. He wasn't sure how to explain his time there, however. So for now, he stuck with the bike story. "I fell off of it while trying to show Greg a trick I'd learned and cut my hand on the concrete." "Oh." Her brows furrowed sympathetically, and she twisted his hand around to see it more clearly. It was faded with time and healing, but there was still a pale silver line illuminating its presence. She ran her finger along its jagged edges, tracing each sprouting path. Wirt shivered, his fingers twitching slightly. Her touch was unbearably gentle, like he was some fragile thing that would shatter at the slightest pressure. "Does it still hurt?" Not really," Wirt said, struggling a bit with his words. Instinct tugged at him, insisting he save his hand from her delicate touch. He wasn't a stranger to his own sensitivity, but he hadn't thought it would extend to his hands. No one had ever spent so much time exploring them before. Wirt wasn't used to the attention, and, evidently, neither was his nervous system. Her nails dug a little into his palm, and his other hand fiddled with the sheets as a distraction. Sara didn't seem to notice as she continued, re-going over spots she had already explored until Wirt was certain that she was doing it more for herself than anything. Wirt wished he could relax into it, like he had before, but it was almost as though being aware of the effect it was having on him was making it worse. His lips curled in a slight grin, a blush dusting over his cheeks. She fanned her fingers over the spot and he huffed, thumb curling into his palm protectively. That she noticed. "Am I bothering you?" She seemed so genuinely concerned that Wirt found it impossible to lie to her. "It just tickles," he explained, his words going soft and shy at the word, like just saying it would cause it to come to reality. "I didn't mean to disrupt you. You can keep going if you like." "Even if it tickles." Wirt glanced away, the red on his cheeks growing brighter by the second. "I don't really mind it. It kind of feels good too, even if it tickles." Sara stared at him a second longer, as though trying to unearth some great secret hidden behind his nervous, shifting eyes. After a while, she simply shrugged, returning to her task, only this time with an added intent. The trace of her nails no longer felt accidental, and Wirt found himself squirming and fidgeting on the bed, his grin wide and horrendously obvious now. The movie was still off, the remote just out of reach, and Wirt resented the silence as it made him overly aware of every stifled sound that slipped out of his mouth. Not quite a laugh, but not quite not. Sara pretended not to notice, but the way her gaze kept sliding over to him every once in a while told a different story. He thought he was doing okay, until her touch slowly shifted downwards. He flinched when her nails curled against his wrist, instinctively pulling his arm back before he could think better of it. My. She glanced up at him, her mouth curving up slightly. Wirt? Sorry. He apologized, the words coming out stilted and awkward. He had never been particularly embarrassed by his own sensitivity before, though maybe he had been, seeing as he still relied on the term sensitivity instead of its true name even within the confines of his own mind. But even he knew that most people didn't have such violent reactions to mere tracing. Well, I just didn't realize I was so, ticklish, she filled in, the grin building into a smirk. His shoulders ducked up at the word, as though that simple action would protect him from its meaning. It's okay. You don't have to be embarrassed. I'm not, he said, probably too defensively. Ticklish or embarrassed? Wirt opened his mouth and closed it, failing to come up with which answer was the most strategic at the current moment. Sara giggled softly, and the sound made Wirt melt a little, even now in the face of his impending doom. She reached for his hand again, and he let her, trying not to seem too eager as she did. May I? She trailed off, glancing down at his bared arm and back up at him, her question implied. Wirt nodded soundlessly, feeling vulnerable and silly and excited all at once. A part of him begged him to pull his arm back, for the sake of his dignity if nothing else. But the acceptance in her eyes kept him there. Wirt shivered as she dragged her nails along the spot once more, goosebumps scattering up his arms. This time she didn't stay dormant, tracing a line from wrist down to the vulnerable inside of his elbow. Wirt curled his legs up to his chest and subtly hid his growing smile behind the back of his other hand. Poetic Bee, she scratched against the area, quick, spidery movements that made his nerves writhe anxiously. It didn't tickle so much as it was tickly, but that was enough to make him want to squirm away again. He didn't. Her fingers climbed up his arm, and he shrunk inch by inch into the bed, a subconscious effort to keep her hands from arriving at their unfortunate destination. She walked her fingers across his shoulder, sneaking around to the crook of his neck. A slew of giggles slipped out as he scrunched his shoulders up, eyes squeezed shut instinctively. Wirt nearly pushed her off when she dragged one nail, soft and feather-light, behind his ear. But he managed to hold back with a protesting whine, squeezing his eyes shut instead. "Ito, you're staying awfully still for someone so ticklish," she noted. A casual observation, but one that made Wirt flush an even darker crimson. "I'm starting to think you're letting me do this more for your benefit than for mine." Wirt was glad that he didn't have to look at her when he responded, thankful for the cover of darkness behind his eyelids. "I think you might be onto so-home thing." "Oh." He could practically hear her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "So you do like it?" His silence was answer enough, and she scratched at the back of his neck to break it with a harried squeal. "Well, if that's the case, I'd be more than happy to keep this up. Until you've had your fill, so to speak. I don't think either of us were paying much attention to the movie anyway." Not wanting to speak and confirm his wish in such a verbal way, Wirt slowly lifted his fist up in an awkward thumbs up. Sara chuckled at that, but Wirt was able to relax in the knowledge that the laughter was with him, rather than at him. "So, you're a weird guy, you know. I like that about you. It's refreshing." Before Wirt could think of formulating an answer to that, or start to deduce whether that was a good or bad thing, Sara's other hand had snaked around and curled into his side. His ever-constant concern slipped away as he barked out a laugh, crumpling into a ticklish mess against the mattress.